I'll do that quickly. When we're thrown into the fire, we can do more than we expect. We adapt to the stresses of the world. The mind will adapt to whatever task you take on.
Each of us has an essentially unlimited capacity for creative potential. If we are thrown into the fire, we find that the mind and our entire being can and will adapt to the stresses of the world, and of whatever task we may be faced with or have chosen to take on. Like water to a vessel, that which we are can mold itself and is molded by our external and internal worlds. These worlds exist relative to one another, like the inside and outside of a ball. To say that the internal and external exist relative to one another is also to say that they require their counterpart in order to exist. The two are in a relationship and rely on the feedback given by one to the other to establish their own phenomenal existence. But then what of the boundary that exists by which internal and external are established as separate from one another? In this analogy, it's the existence of the ball that presupposes the internal and external divide. Applying the analogy to our own consciousness, that differentiating factor that divides up the world is us. I've briefly mentioned now two metaphysical analogies which propose some idea as to the conceptualization and understanding of our own being. Firstly, our capacity of self and mind to change and adapt like water, which has the quality of shaping itself to the contours of its vessel. And secondly, paralleling the situation of our own existence, the internal and external worlds of the ball, which, by virtue of the state of its being, is the divider of the world into two. As any point on a sphere is its center, so too we experience existence at its center. We are always at the center of our individual experience, and are similarly in our own individual existences, the great divider of the internal from the external. Now you might be thinking,
what the hell does that mean?
Well, it means to a large extent that we are the creators of our internal and external worlds, that we are at the root of our conception and perception of ourselves, and that we can transform those perceptions in order to transcend any state we may find ourselves bound. It's an overly complicated way of saying anything's possible. Humanity and its individual's greatest gift is its ability to transcend and adapt to any challenge through change. A gift we have learnt of our possession of by having observed nature itself, which seems to forever plough forward at the head of the wheel of birth and death, endlessly changing and adapting. In regards to our own lives, that change is delegated to the individual, to each guardian of duality whose role we find ourselves in. With a change of perception, we can shift the internal and external worlds that surround us at will, in order to craft an ever more suitable and evolved way of existing. It kind of means that we can be whatever we want to be. You could be anything. Your life meaning could be anything. Or, in other words,
it means whatever the hell you want it to mean.
Or does it? I can't very well be a black man. I can't be a cat. Even if I happen to believe that in some way I'm connected to black ancestry, or that in another life I was a mighty lion patrolling the savannah. And no matter the validity of these self-beliefs, I'm still clearly not manifest as a cat. And I'm not any other skin color than my own. Maybe anything is possible is too much of a blanket statement. albeit with inspirational intention. There are limitations to our possibilities, but those limitations aren't inhibitors to our potential. They are constructive channels for our potential to flow through. Like the movement of water through pipes, electricity through wire, or light through optical cabling, there is energy and there is its channel, and our potential is this energy, and those channels are our limitations. Our limitations are among our greatest endowments, but I'll speak more on that later. That which limits us provides constructive indication of what to focus our attention on changing and what not to fall into identifying with. Let's take a step adjacent to this idea for a moment. I am not Chinese. I was not born in China, but I could learn to speak Chinese. In fact, I have tried. The identity of Chinese is arbitrary in regards to whether one can actually speak the language. However, no matter how well I speak Chinese, I still will never have in this life been born in China, and therefore by this semantic approach could never be Chinese. This is an important distinction. Seeking meaning through an identity based on arbitrary classifications surrounding the randomness of one's birth, and that speak nothing of the complexity of the individual, is like seeking chastity advice on Pornhub. It's just not the place for it. The difference being that meaningful identity is based on our actions within the world, not the happenstance of our avatar's incarnation. This happenstance is spoken of by philosopher Martin Heidegger and termed thrownness. Thrownness is used to describe this characteristic of human experience, that the circumstances of our birth, the culture and time we are born into, and the entire context of our having arisen in existence seems arbitrary. It feels as though we were thrown randomly into existence without choice of the details of our birth. If I had in this life been thrown into a body born and raised in China, then I would no doubt speak the language. If I had been thrown into a feline form of a cat, I wouldn't look like this. I'd look something like that. If I was born into a black body, I'd be able to dap. But I'm none of those. I'm not a cat, I'm not Chinese, I'm not black. But that doesn't matter. In fact, they are completely arbitrary. It doesn't matter at all what classification of phenomena I am. I am what I am, whatever that may happen to be. And you are, whatever you may happen to be. And it's from that point that we act. And the act is the important part.
And so with this ever more clearly a reality, the fact that to take on a task, our mind will expand to it, will take its shape, like water to any kind of vessel. The question arises, several questions arise. One part of that question, one of those questions is, well, to what limit can I apply my mind to in terms of grandness of a task? To what limit can mind expand to any given task? That's one question. Question two, what do I want? Or what do you want? Why not is another question. Why not attempt as grand a task I see envisionable? Why not? The why not tends me to answer like, well, yeah, why not? Let's do it. The let's do it leads me to think, okay, well, what? What is it I really want? Because the more grand you scale the task, the more of your life is involved. And so if you're going to involve like 95% of your life doing something, you got to really want it. Your heart's got to be in it.
We understand that the classification of our characteristics that arise out of our thrown existence should never be the basis of our self-worth, nor the reason to judge another person. And that perhaps, in order to find meaningful self-worth, we need to find a meaningful role to act out in the world. We know that people may be born in completely different cultural circumstances, and yet find themselves drawn together and inspired by the actions of one another. Think of any individual that has inspired you. Do they inspire you because they were born in a particular place, or a particular time, a particular colour or ethnicity? I would assume not. What inspires people is one's actions, and those actions are choices made, not circumstances fallen into. Now that we are aware of the arbitrariness of our unchangeable characteristics, and that action is what is most important in cultivating a meaningful identity, how do we decide on a role to play? How do we know what actions to take? Well, if we're going to take on a great task, one that takes up a majority of our life, then it needs to be one that excites and draws us towards it naturally. This is another way of saying that our heart must be in it. Otherwise, we wouldn't act at all. So we must find out what we truly want. What do we love? The soul attracts that which it secretly harbours, that which it loves, and also that which it fears. It reaches the height of its cherished aspirations, and it falls to the level of its unchastened desires. Circumstances are but the means by which the soul receives its own. Every thought seed sown or allowed to fall into the mind and to take root there produces its own, blossoming sooner or later into act, and bearing its own fruitage of opportunity and circumstance. Good thoughts bear good fruit. Bad thoughts, bad fruit. I'd like to note here as well the specification that over time, those thought seeds that fall into our mind will blossom into act. What we maintain within our mind is the expression that we act out. We don't act out anything that's different from how we think. So if we want to change how we act in the world, it starts within the garden of the mind. And the flourishing of those particular seeds, or the change of a mental attitude, will equate to the change of opportunity externally. And that's the important part. Through your actions. Your actions are what mediate this. Begins in the mind, allows you to mediate your actions, and then the circumstances of your life will change. From my perspective. Alright, back to the book. The outer world of circumstance shapes itself to the inner world of thought. And both pleasant and unpleasant external conditions are factors which make for the ultimate good of the individual. As the reaper of his own harvest, man learns both by suffering and bliss. Following the inmost desires, aspirations, thoughts by which one allows oneself to be dominated, pursuing the will-o'-the-wisps of impure imaginations, and steadfastly walking the highway of strong and high endeavour, one at last will arrive at their fruition and fulfilment in the outer conditions of life. The laws of growth and adjustment everywhere obtain. We are becoming more and more aware that the fluidity of our beingness allows us the ability to change who we are within, and as a result, our perceptions of the world around us. Being the guardians of the rift between internal and external, we can modulate that which we allow to dwell within the mind, and therefore shift our circumstances in the external world. As above, so below. As within, so without. What we harbour within, what we love and what we fear most deeply are those things that motivate our perceptual manifestations of the external world. In the following clip, Ram Dass touches on this phenomena of perception and motivation.
Each person is receiving what I'm saying through a set of filters based on their own needs and desires and perception. It's like, this is an old saw of psychology, that motivation affects perception. Like if three of us are driving through a town and you are hungry, but you don't want to admit it because none of us want to eat. The other end of town, if I say, what was in that town? What do you remember about that town? You say, well, there was a McDonald's and there was a health food store I saw down the street. Now, I'm an old car buff, you see, and so I'm driving my car and I'm listening for the squeaks and I'm figuring where it's going to have to be towed to next. So if you ask me what was in the town, I'll say, well, there was a Shell station and there was a foreign car service. And if the third member is horny, what they will remember is who was standing under the clock. That's what they'll remember of the town. Each of us went through a different town.
Depending on our motivations, each of us will be moving through completely different worlds, personally motivated to perceive the infinitely variable phenomena of the external world in a particular focus. That which draws our focus towards it, that grabs our attention in the external world, has its roots in our internal world of the mind and its functions. So we must tend to and cultivate the garden of our minds, guarding it against infiltration by useless and harmful stimuli from the external world. Each of our senses is like a threshold between the inner realms of self and outer realms of the external world. In Buddhism, these are spoken of as the 6 sense doors, those being the doors of seeing, hearing, smelling, touching, tasting, and thinking. So how do we become more aware of the currents that flow into us? We can practice limiting the flow of the external world by sitting down, closing our eyes, and shutting down our doors of perception. That is, limiting our activity so that our senses need not be engaged. And thus, we are left with ourselves, with nothing else to do but observe the action that continues within the mind once it is cut off from the external world. So, is that it? All we need to do is sit in the dark and meditate and everything is going to be fixed? Of course not. No one thing is ever going to fix everything. In fact, an entire ecology of actions are required if we wish to keep ourselves consciously operating with awareness at all. Meditation on its own is not going to fix our messed up 21st century minds. So then why even suggest it? What use is this sitting quietly? We can look at the world we live in for appropriate analogies. For example, our bodies. In order for our bodies to exist, blood is necessary. But if our entire body was blood, it wouldn't work. In order for our ears to work, we need silence. We can't hear the silence, but in order to hear anything adequately, there needs to be silence filling the gaps between the sound. If there was no air filling the apparent gaps between the solid objects around us, we couldn't breathe. In every instance, a balance is required. It comes back to the relationship between our internal and external worlds. If we never stop the inward flow of external stimuli, we won't have the breathing room to clearly see what's flowing back out in response from within. That is, our desires, motivations, and perceptions, etc. In cloudy water, dirt constantly swirls around and the water lacks clarity. This is like our state of mind when we are constantly allowing the external world to enter the internal, particularly when the external stimuli are coming from a multitude of directions and at a high frequency. For comparison, take 15 minutes spent reading a book versus 15 minutes spent app hopping between Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. Much of our lives lack mental clarity. The world is increasingly fast-paced and noisy, and thus there seems to be increasingly less space for us to slow down and be quiet. Sitting down and being quiet provides us the space to see what's going on in our own minds, and gives us insight into what's driving our actions within the world. It's much easier to be swept along if we don't give ourselves this chance to take stock, to sit quietly, and to stew in our thoughts, so that we can really get a taste of that which fills our mind. Seeing clearly within becomes ever more difficult to do when we are allowing constant distractions from the outside world to stir us up. From day to day, our minds are like whirlpools of dusty water, constantly engaged and occupied, constantly cloudy and opaque. We cannot see into that water until movement ceases and the dirt is allowed to settle into the depths. The same goes for our minds. Increasing depths of insight requires an ever-deepening stillness. And as we become more conscious of our inner world, we will begin to notice with ever more presence our personal tendencies. Tendencies that, arbitrary as they may be, happen to make up a majority of our actions and character in the world. These are the breadcrumbs that will lead us back from our actions, through our perceptions, down to our desires, and ultimately to our innermost thoughts and beliefs that we encourage and to which we find ourselves bound.